Today we're going to be talking about normativity. But first let's talk about the test, because there's a test on Tuesday, right? So the first term test is our next class. It's going to be in the regular classroom at the regular time. It's not an ideal room to write a test in, but we'll make do. I think possibly we'll move the second test to this room. This would be a much nicer room to write a test in, but we all have to vote 2 weeks in advance in order to make that kind of change to the syllabus. So this time we'll just do it in the regular classroom. The test will be 40 minutes long, and show up at the regular time. Show up at 1:10, please. But we'll start 5 minutes after, and it'll only run for 40 minutes. So it'll be a fairly short test. We haven't even really done all that much, so there's not that much to test you on, really. But the format will be 10 multiple choice questions, which you'll fill out on a Scantron sheet, and then 5 short answer questions, which will be definitions or explanations or sort of broad open questions, and then 1 argument to map. So I'll give you 1 short argument to map that will be about the level of complexity that you saw on the last sheet, sort of like 3 or 4 premises, where everything is a premise and there's not too much ambiguity, okay? So that shouldn't be too bad. Bring a pen or pencil if you wish, and a paper dictionary if you wish. No, definitely bring a pen or pencil, not whether you wish. If you wish, bring a paper dictionary. It can be helpful if you don't know one of the words on the test, or something like that. And just a warning, if you miss the test, usually in a class this size there are a few people who miss the test. Do not email me a week after the test and say, I missed the test, please accommodate me. Email me within 24 hours of the test, or you will lose your window to write a makeup. Okay? Like if you get hit by a car the day of the test and you're unconscious for a week, then we'll figure it out. But barring that level of being unable to send an email, then get in touch as soon as you possibly can. Okay? So we haven't got any exercises to do in class today. I think I've got too much talking to do today to have time for that. I put another round of argument diagramming exercises on the blackboard, so you can take a look at those sort of between now and Monday. I'll post what I take to be good answers on Monday. Okay? So you got some homework, voluntary homework, but if you want more practice before the test. I've also posted a list of what I consider to be key course terms on the blackboard. So for the definitions and explanations, I'm going to be drawing from that list to write the test. If you find something on that list that's totally unfamiliar to you, maybe shoot me an email and ask me about it, right? Or ask one of your friends or go back over the lectures. All of those are good options. So the terms on that list, it's a little over a page. So there's not like only 1 or 2, but hopefully you'll be familiar enough with all of those ideas to explain what they mean, maybe define them, use them to solve problems and that kind of thing. Okay? Any questions about the test? Good. So, last time we were talking about missing premises, right? This idea that it's not the case that every argument has all of its premises just written out. Sometimes they are sort of left for the reader to fill in themselves. If the premise is super obvious, if it's something that's just sort of easy to recognize. So James owns a Mustang. We went straight from James owns a Mustang to therefore James owns a car and left implicit. Usually people would leave something like and a Mustang is a car implicit, unless you're speaking to somebody who you know knows absolutely nothing about cars. Right? So that's a missing premise. And when you're diagramming arguments in the argument analyses, and if I ask you specifically on the test, your job will be to identify any premises that you need to make the premises that are given relevant to the conclusion. Right? So the missing premise draws out how a premise is supposed to be related to the conclusion that it supports. Right? Now today we're going to talk about, so this one is a descriptive missing premise. Right? It's just a fact of the matter. Mustangs are cars. Today we're going to be talking about another class of missing premises, which we briefly looked at the end of last class, which is normative missing premises. So it's not the case that all missing premises are normative, and it's neither is it the case that all normative claims are missing premises. Lots of times people actually articulate their normative principles or their normative premises, but very, very often they don't. And I suggested very briefly last time, it's because most people, most of the time, agree on our value judgments. And so if I say pain is bad, maybe 1% of you will want to reject that in some context, right? Like, very few people think pain is great. So when I say, if you touch the electric fence, you'll feel pain, you should very smoothly and naturally go from that premise to don't touch the electric fence, right? It should be just totally easy and natural. But again, what we're trying to do in this class is take things that are easy and natural, slow them down, understand how they work, so that you can make explicit exactly what the actual line of reasoning is. So this is one of those cases where we're taking something that, you know, if you're a smart person, you shouldn't even blink when you see, you know, you'll feel pain, so don't touch the electric fence. But we need to stop the natural flow of your reasoning and sort of get you to articulate every part of the argument so that you can critique every part of the argument. Okay? Now, these are normative premises, right? So they say something about what should be the case or what ought to be the case or what's good or bad. And that's the idea of normativity is what we're going to spend this class talking about. And I'll warn you up front, this is probably going to be more me talking than a usual class. It's also going to be quite a bit more philosophy than we usually do in this class. So I'm going to do a bunch of abstract, like, ethical theories for you. I'm not going to get too deep into any of them, but I do think it's helpful for you to have that kind of intellectual machinery in the background so that you can have a fully articulated picture of what justifies value claims, if anything does. Okay? So what are normative claims? Compare these two claims. This apple is red, or this apple is good. So the first claim is descriptive. It just describes the state of the apple, right? And you can measure it, right? You can use various tools to measure the color of things. If you say it's red and I say it's not, we can come up with an objective way of telling who's right or who's wrong, right? You can observe it, you can measure it, and people can be wrong about it. Now, how about this apple is good? What exactly would you measure? So if I say this apple's good and you say this apple's bad, what would you measure to figure out which of us is right? Yeah. The taste, yeah? Yeah, so, I mean, you could measure how many, there's certain molecules that are the bearers of flavor. You could measure how many of those molecules are in the apple. Now, to get to good from that, so I would say this apple is full of juicy flavor. So I can measure how much moisture it's got. I can measure how many like aromatic chemicals are in it. Now what do you need to get from that to this apple is good? Yeah. Flavorful things are good. Right. Right. So we still haven't measured its goodness as such. What you've measured is something that makes it good, and then we have a normative principle that says that thing is desirable. Right? If you like bland, flavorless apples with no moisture content, then if I tell you, look, I measured this apple and it's got full of juice and full of flavor, you'd be like, ew, gross. I don't like that. I just need these apples to throw at people. I don't need them to eat, right? For me, a good apple is one that's dense, right, and hard, or something like that. So your purposes come into what's good or bad. Your goals come into what normative judgments you're going to make. And people there's a wide possibilities for disagreement with normative claims, which leads some people to say things like, these are just opinions, right? There's no fact of the matter about what's good or bad. It's a very common opinion. And we'll look at some of the arguments for that position, which is called moral anti-realism at the end of this lecture. We'll also look at some of the arguments against that position that says, no, no, no. If you get clear enough what you mean by good and bad, you can turn it into something that you can measure. Okay, so the point of this lecture is not to convince you of any one moral perspective or even that moral talk makes sense. Really, I just want you to know the range of opinions that people have articulated about normativity and be able to sort of navigate the different arguments and perspectives. That's the goal here today. Okay. So very often there are clues in the language, sort of explicit markers for when somebody's making a normative claim. So you should wash your hands. Should is an explicit marker of a claim being normative, right? So should wash your hands says it is good if you did wash your hands or something like that. You didn't wash your hands is not itself a normative claim, right? You're describing a situation. You're not saying whether it's good or bad. Again, you can imagine a context in which somebody thinks that you shouldn't wash your hands, right? You can imagine that. You ought to take your time there. Ought is a classic normative term. All of the ones in blue, this aqua color, are like really clear markers that somebody's made a normative claim. You're faster than yesterday really just says that you're faster. It doesn't say whether it's good or bad to be fast. Murder is wrong. Wrongness is one of those really obvious normative claims. Actually, I think murder is also a normative claim, because if you say, you murdered somebody in war, you say, well, you didn't murder them, you killed them in war, right? Like, murder implies a moral wrongness of killing. So murder itself is also a normative claim, but if you say murder is wrong, you got like two normative claims in your sentence, right? Whereas the murder rate is down, I don't know, if you're a gun manufacturer, maybe that's bad news for you, right? So depending on your goals, I think you're a horrible person if you think that, but nonetheless, just saying the murder rate is down is not making a normative claim. Charity is a virtue. Virtue is another one of those really classic, obvious markers that something's a normative claim. It's bad to litter. Usury is a sin. Usury is, by the way, the charging of interest for loans, which I believe all three of the Abrahamic religions explicitly say is wrong. OSAP charges interest is not a moral claim by itself. Okay, so those are explicit markers that something is a normative claim. There's huge classes of normative claims that don't come explicitly marked. For example, imperatives. So if I say, study for the test, I'm telling you, you should study for the test. But I haven't given you one of these nice explicit markers, right? So anytime you're telling somebody what to do, there's an implicit, you ought to do what I'm saying, right? So very often normative claims don't come with one of these nice, clear markers. And I don't really know how to tell you in general how to identify them. Anytime I've been doing this, I've been sort of just going from one normative claim, say, you should wash your hands. Well, that's just like saying you ought to wash your hands. It's very hard to explain normativity without using other normative language. But I take it that this is so fundamental to like being a human that you all know exactly what I'm talking about, right? When I'm talking about normativity. The should, the ought, the good, the bad. Like, I don't know how to get under normative language to non-normative language so that you can explain it without using it, but here we are anyway. I mean, I take it that these are ideas that you learned from before you were in kindergarten, right? Your parents use normative language all the time. Don't do that, don't do this. Pick up after yourself, all that stuff, right? Okay. So, there's a principle that comes from David Hume, and I think I very briefly mentioned this last time. Most philosophers agree with at least one form of this. So there's debate about what exactly Hume meant when he said, you can't derive an ought from an is. Some people think what that means is there simply are no moral facts at all, that there's no true or false normative claims. I'm not going to sort of advance that for you to believe, but there is a version of this that I'd like you to subscribe to, and I'm going to kind of require in the structure of your assignments, which is you can't get a normative conclusion without a normative premise. That's the version of this that I think is worthwhile for our purposes, right? So if there's a should or an ought or a good or a bad in your conclusion, if there's none of that in your premises, you've made an inferential error, right? Your argument is invalid. Because, just saying, if you don't study for the test, you're going to fail, doesn't tell you that you should study for the test, right? That's just the first thing is just a fact. Maybe you don't care about passing the test. Maybe that's not one of your life goals, right? So you need, in addition to, this will have that outcome, in addition to that, you need and that outcome is bad. And we're going to spend most of the class talking about how you justify those normative premises that you need to combine with descriptive premises to get a normative conclusion, right? And these various ethical theories that we'll look at are ways of justifying normative premises. Okay. So just as an example, this is all just Hume's law in action. Your hands are dirty does not by itself entail you should wash your hands. Maybe you like your hands being dirty. Maybe you're almost out of water. You don't want to use the last liter of potable drinking water to wash your hands, even if they're dirty, right? You need something like, and it's good to be clean, for this to even inductively lead to the conclusion. Similarly, astronomy can teach us new facts about the universe, therefore we should fund astronomy, does not follow, right? That inference, according to Hume's law, does not follow because there's a should in the conclusion and no normative principle in the premise. There's no normative claim in the premise. You need something like, and knowledge is good, right? If you don't care about knowledge, the fact that astronomy can teach you about the universe tells you nothing about where you should spend your money, right? Because you don't care about knowledge, right? Okay. So what I propose to present to you, basically for the rest of the lecture, is this 5-level model of normativity. And so I strongly suggest, I would almost insist, that all of you should believe that at least the bottom 3 layers make sense to talk about. You're not talking nonsense when you're talking about these bottom 3 layers. So behavior, all of you behave. I can see all of you behaving right now. All of you have goals, because you wouldn't have made it this far in your life if you didn't have some goals. Like you had the goal of showing up here today, and if you didn't, you wouldn't have shown up here today. And furthermore, in a specific sense of values that I'll spend some time articulating, you all have values. Now, the next 2 layers of ethical theories and meta-ethical theories are a matter of considerable debate. So there are serious, smart philosophers who've thought a lot about this, who think there are no justifiable ethical theories. And that's a position in meta-ethics. Okay, so these are the people who are ethical anti-realists. They think all this ethical talk, all this normative talk is actually just kind of nonsense. And so I won't insist that you think that there are good ethical theories, and that's a position in meta-ethics. I guess I have to insist that you believe that meta-ethics is a thing, because that's just, if you believe that there's no such thing as good ethical theories, then you have a position in meta-ethics. But we're really not going to worry about, for the rest of the course, we're really not going to worry about the level of ethical theories or meta-ethical theories. I'm going to teach you that because I think it is helpful for you as humans and for intellectual background or something like that. But it's the level of values that you really need to get to do the assignments, right? So throughout your argument analyses, they're going to be making values claims, and you need to be able to spot them and understand them. So that's why you need to know values, and to properly situate values, I think you should know both what goes above them and below them kind of thing, right? Okay. So start from the bottom. We're going to start from the bottom level where it's obvious that this stuff, talking about this stuff makes sense, and then move up slowly but surely to where it gets a little more abstract and weird. So behavior. This is just literally all of the things that you can do. And let's include in behavior both physical and mental acts. So if you're paying attention to me, that's something that you're doing. It's a kind of behavior that you're doing. If you think of a funny rhyme, that's a kind of behavior that you're doing. Or like if you're sitting there working on a problem set and you're stuck, and then you realize how to get through it before you've moved your pencil, that's still a kind of behavior. Like having an insight is a kind of behavior. So in addition to all of the things that you can do with your body, right? So anything that you can do with your body or your mind counts as behavior in this context. And what I'd like you to notice about that set of things is that it's unimaginably vast. There are an unimaginably vast number of behaviors and combinations of behaviors that you could engage in given the way that you're made up, right? Like the number of moves in chess is already unimaginably vast. It's like 10 to the 40 or something like that, so 10 with 40 zeros after it. The number of grammatical English sentences is way bigger than that. And forming sentences is just one of the behaviors you can engage in, right? Consider the number of possible, this strikes me often when I'm trying to write something. I'm looking at that blank page and thinking, how many possible sentences are there that I could just start writing? And the number is just baffling. It makes astronomical numbers look tiny by comparison. If you take the number of atoms in the universe times the number of seconds since the Big Bang, it doesn't even compare It's tiny compared to the number of possible sentences that you could bang out on your laptop. So this space is mind-bogglingly large. What you need, and furthermore, almost all of the directions, so if you just pick a random direction of your behaviors, the chances that you're going to come up with something good are so low, it's laughable, right? If you just like, oh, I'm going to move my hand and then say the word tree, and then like move my foot, like those are all behaviors that I have, but what did that get me? Nothing, right? So if you just pick random behaviors, your life is going to be terrible, okay? So what you need is something to help you pick from that vast, unimaginable space of possibilities some finite set of things that are like coordinated with each other, right? So you need goals, right? So your goals are what organize your behavior. They tell you of the vast space of possible behaviors that you could engage in, which ones to pick out. So you can have big life goals, you know, like I want to have kids, that's a big life goal. Or you can have small scale, like daily goals. Like suppose you're trying to make yourself some lunch. Okay, my goal is make myself lunch. So what you do is you wander into your kitchen, presumably. You say, okay, what have I got? That goal can have sub-goals like, okay, I want to make lunch. How do I make lunch? Well, I'll make a cucumber sandwich. Now I have a sub-goal. Okay, so what do I need to make a cucumber sandwich? I need bread, cucumber, some butter, some cheese. Now, you go to the fridge and you have none of those things. So your sub-goal is frustrated. What do you do now? You revert to the original goal, make myself lunch, and reformulate your sub-goal. Say, okay, how do I get to this goal? It can't be cucumber sandwiches. What else have I got? So you figure out something else to make so that you can achieve your original goal of making lunch. Okay, so your behaviors are flexibly and dynamically organized into goals and sub-goals and sub-sub-goals, right? And being an intelligent agent, like the difference between you and basically any of the robots that we build now, is that you have this flexibility where you can define your goals and redefine your goals flexibly, adaptively, right? This should all be so, I should just be telling you like basic facts of your life that you're just so totally familiar with, it's completely uncontroversial, yeah? Okay. So, goals, we talked about behavior, we talked a little bit about goals. Goals tell you how to behave. So in order to figure out which of the vast possible behaviors you should engage in, you figure out what your goals are. Now, the thing about you as intelligent agents is that you don't come with your goals pre-built in, for most of the time. I suppose like we could define some really low-level goals like continue to get enough oxygen, right? That one's probably built in. It's not really optional. Like if you get deprived of oxygen, you get really upset, and pretty much all of your resources will be devoted to solving that, to reestablishing success on that goal, right? But so many of your goals, typically, your goals are flexibly and adaptively defined, right? You don't come with them just pre-built. You have to set them for yourself. And now you have a problem. Or not a problem necessarily, but a question. What goals should you set for yourself? Right? What should your goals be? And I would like to suggest that the thing that tells you, it's just exactly analogous to the how should I behave? Well, your goals tell you. What goals should I have? Well, and that's what your values tell you. Right? So your values establish for you what goals you should have. So in a sense, they organize your goals, right? Which ones should you set? You could think of values really as just sort of abstract meta goals, right? Usually a goal, we think of a goal as having a specific concrete outcome that you're trying to bring about, like make myself lunch, or have a kid, or pass university, you know? Whereas values tend to be more broad and sort of fixed over time. So like my goal of having lunch, making myself lunch, disappears as soon as I'm done having lunch. Whereas my value for having a good life or something like that typically persists for much longer than that. Your values are also flexible, of course. Your values can change over your life. They can change due to life experiences or change because you decided that they needed to change. But they are typically understood as more stable than goals. So your values are your picture of what's important, right? And they tell you, so your picture of what's important tells you which goals you should be setting, right? Now, so far, everything that I've said to you is totally consistent with having a bunch of incoherent values, values that conflict with each other. So you could have the value of, you want to say, like, look, I really want to succeed in life. I want to achieve great things, the esteem of my peers. I want to, like, make a lot of money. Also, I want to really relax and take it easy and enjoy my days and just cruise through life. Nothing that I've said so far tells you that you can't have both of those values. But what's your life going to be like if you have those exact two values? It's going to be tough, right? Like, it's not going to work. Like, say you have those two perfectly balanced. You say, like, I want both of those things, and I want to organize my life such that I get a little bit of each of them. That's okay. But if you don't recognize that those are kind of pulling against each other, you're not going to achieve your goals. You're going to be frustrated in your projects, right? So values can compete, and they can be incoherent in that way. So then the question is, again, analogous to the one before, what should your values be? Okay, so that they can compete or be incoherent is relevant to the argument mapping stuff because typically there's an inferential relation between, there's a inductive relation between value statements and that you should pursue a goal. So you have a test on Tuesday, there's a missing premise or just a premise. It's important to study for the tests, therefore you should study. Okay, is that a deductive argument? I don't think so. I don't think that's a deductive argument. To make it a deductive argument, the normative premise there should be something like, the most important thing is to study for tests, right? So imagine, for example, you have a test on Tuesday. Your spouse died on Monday. Now should you study for the test? No. There's much more important things for you to be thinking about, right? So to say that it's important, you can still, but that's nonetheless, it's important to study for tests, nonetheless, but you could have much more important things going on at the time, right? So that proves that what that shows is that this is not a deductive argument. It's an inductive argument. That it's important to study for tests, if you accept that premise, is evidence for the conclusion. It's not zero evidence for the conclusion, but neither should it guarantee the conclusion. Right? So in your specific circumstances, you might accept this value judgment and yet accept other value judgments as being more important in that context. Right? Like, you're a volunteer firefighter and there's a house on fire and you got a test on Tuesday. Well, probably you should go put out the fire, right? Because there's another value judgment that's competing with this one, which is don't let people's houses burn down, or something like that. You'd have to formulate this value judgment really, really strongly to make this a deductive argument. Okay. And this is, so it's relevant to you for judging arguments with value judgments in them, because oftentimes people will treat these as though they follow directly and deductively. Like say, well, you know, everybody agrees it's important to study for tests, therefore, don't talk to me about any other value judgments. This is the one that's relevant. And it's just not the case that typically value judgments are just definitive in that sense, because you have lots of things that you value, and they compete with each other for your time, attention, and resources, right? So your values are your picture of where to spend your tiny little life. You've got a tiny, tiny little amount of free energy, a tiny, tiny little amount of attention, a tiny, tiny little amount of money. Well, most of us do have a tiny, tiny amount of money. I sure do. So your question, your value question is, where do you spend those finite resources, right? And a value judgment says, this thing's worth spending resources on. Right? You should study for tests, so you should take some of your very limited time, energy, and attention and study for your test. But that's not to say that there's nothing else competing for those resources, of course. Right? You've probably got other things going on in your life than this class, for example. right? And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that this class is the most important thing in your life. Maybe it's not. I hope it's not. I hope you have other things to do. But nonetheless, it's still true that it's important to study for tests in general, and therefore you should study for this test, inductively speaking. Yeah? Okay. So those are just a couple of points on how value judgments function in arguments, right? They, generally speaking, function inductively. Generally speaking, when somebody asserts a value judgment, what they're saying is, this is a good reason, but you can't maintain the claim that it's the only thing that you need to consider. Sometimes you can. Like, you can have inductive arguments. You can have deductive moral arguments, like if you say, it's always wrong to lie, therefore don't lie. That would be a deductive argument, right? Very hard to establish that first thing as true. As with many deductive arguments, the tighter the inferential relation, the more pressure there is on the premises to be true. But that would be a deductive argument. Very few people make that kind of value judgments, though, and you probably won't encounter them in your argument analyses. All right, so back to this 5-level thing. So values tell you what goals to set. Now, you have this question of which values you should have. What are the right values? What are the important values? Does that question even make sense? Some people say no. Some people say, no, you've just got from biology, some combination of biology and your culture, you got handed some values. End of story. That's just it. That's all there is to be said about values, is that they were produced by some causal mechanism, and now you got them, and now you try to get what you want according to those values. But not everybody thinks that. So lots of people have tried to say, actually, we can say some interesting and important things about what you should value. So everybody has values, I would suggest to you, because your goals have to be coherent enough to get you through your day, and your goals are organized according to some value structure. Maybe not every human on the planet. There could be exceptional people who just don't have coherent value structures. But all of you, I'm quite confident, have some kind of value structure in your life. Not everybody has a well-articulated ethical theory. I'm not sure I have a well-articulated ethical theory. I'm sure that I don't have just one theory that I rely on, right? So I can't tell you exactly what to value. What I can do is go through 8 examples in 4 different categories of ethical theories and tell you what other people have said about this. And then you can judge for yourself whether you find any of them or all of them convincing. So, ethical theories are supposed to justify value claims. And again, I've been emphasizing that not everybody agrees that value claims can be justified. So there should be a big question mark over everything that I'm about to say for like the next hour of, does this all make sense? But in some sense, if you don't have a sufficient degree of control over your life, all of this stuff about ethical theories is irrelevant to you. Because if you have no control over your own values, then the issue of which values you should have doesn't even arise for you, right? If you have no capacity to shape your own values, I would recommend that you try to get some, right? Have some capacity to shape your own values. It's really nice. It's really helpful. And I think it makes you more of a person in some sense, right? But oftentimes people are just denied that because of the circumstances of their life. Sometimes your culture only has one acceptable set of values and you're severely punished for deviating from them. That's a case in which really you don't have much control over your own values. So you need like a reasonably open life, you need some time to reflect, you need all these great resources in order to have any control over your own values, and you need a lot of energy to change what you value. But it is possible. So these ethical theories, if you're in the position where you can sort of shape your own values, these ethical theories are pictures of how you should be doing that, right? There's quite a number of them from all over history, all over the world. And they make different recommendations about which values you should develop. Now, I'm going to present to you 4 kinds of ethical theories, and I want to insist right off that these are not mutually exclusive categories. So I'll look at 2 that kind of nicely fit each of these, but I will emphasize that a given ethical theory can fall under more than one of these categories. How are we doing? Okay, let's start in on this at least. We'll take a break in maybe 5 minutes or something like that. All right, so the ethics of consequence, we'll call this one. So this type of ethical theory defines what's good and bad in terms of the consequences of your actions, right? So what should I do? Well, you should determine what you should do in terms of what the consequences of those actions are. If an action has good consequences, then it's a good action, something like that. Now, what do you mean by good? Okay, this is just a kind of ethical theory. It's not itself an ethical theory. So let's look at an ethical theory that falls under this kind. Ethical egoism. So ethical egoism says what's good is whatever makes me personally happy. Okay? So if it makes me happy to kick babies and take your stuff or whatever that is, that's what's good. Right? This is not popular amongst people. Don't usually like people who hold this view are typically quiet about it, because if other people find out you think this, they're not going to like let you near their babies or whatever. Like they're not going to be nice to you, because this is an incredibly selfish version of ethics, right? This is the kind of ethics that a 2-year-old operates on, where they're just like, whatever is good, whatever makes me feel good is what's good. And then usually people slowly morally develop where they start to consider the needs and wants of other people. So ethical egoism, I think we kind of all start from this, and then we have it sort of like socially trained out of us to not be like this. Here's a more commonly held kind of ethics of consequence as utilitarianism. You got John Stuart Mill there looking terribly, terribly happy. Doesn't he look just thrilled with happiness? All right, so utilitarianism is kind of like ethical egoism, but instead of focusing on just what makes me happy, the question is what makes the most people happy, right? So what is good is whatever produces the most happiness for the most people. Now, so I shouldn't just do stuff that makes me feel good. I should make stuff, whatever you should do is whatever produces the most happiness for the most people. Some questions that you might raise about that proposal: what do you mean by happiness exactly? It's not so easy. It's not so easy to say what exactly happiness is. Like, for example, people who have children, like on average, report a dramatic decline in their happiness levels, but an increase in their overall life satisfaction. So which of those is the important one, right? It might be that your day-to-day life is crummier than it was when you were free and like just a non-parent, but that nonetheless there's some kind of deeper happiness that you access by having this humongous thing that this project that you're undergoing, right? Or like, you know, any really hard project might make you unhappy in this kind of sense of just feeling a bunch of displeasure throughout your day, but is nonetheless worthwhile to you because you have a broader conception of happiness or something like that. So to be in utilitarianism, to be a utilitarian, you have to kind of specify exactly what you mean by happiness. You also have to figure out a way of counting happiness, right? You have to figure out, if you're going to actually use this theory to tell you what we should do, you have to have a way of measuring what produces what amount of happiness, right? You have to answer questions like, on what time scale are we talking about? Like, are we measuring actions in terms of how much happiness they produce today, or in the next year, or the next 100 years, or the next million years? If you've heard of the effective altruist movement, these are utilitarians who are like, actually, our time scale should be like 1,000,000 years. And that gives you consequences like, it doesn't matter how much unhappiness you create to people right now, because there's going to be way more people in the next 1,000,000 years than are on Earth now. So you could devastate 99% of the population if it produced an outcome that would make humanity happy for 1,000,000 years, something like that. There are various versions of utilitarianism. Most of them wouldn't endorse that. Most of them say, actually, you should try to keep the people around you happy, something like that. But given answers to those two questions, what is happiness and how do you measure it, utilitarianism actually has this really nice result that what's morally good or bad, if you define moral good in these terms, you say, what do you mean by good? I mean whatever produces the most happiness for the most people. You have an objective measure of moral goodness, don't you? It's a fact of the matter, and you can be wrong about it, right? You can think that your action is going to produce the most happiness for the most people, but be mistaken. So if this is right, there's a great deal of debate about this, if this is right, then it provides an objective measure of goodness and badness. Not bad, right? How do you feel about utilitarianism? Just quickly. Okay, no strong feelings. Let's do start up again. So we just saw, we're looking through four different kinds of ethical theory. We just saw two types of the first kind, ethical egoism and utilitarianism. Now we're on to the second kind of ethical theories. These are ethics of duty. So ethics of duties define your ethical obligations in terms of your intentions to act, and say your intentions must correspond to various moral duties that you've got. Right? So that contrasts with the ethics of consequence, who say you figure out what's good and bad in terms of what consequences your actions have. This one focuses on intentions. So you have to figure out what's right or wrong in terms of good and bad intentions, and you figure out which intentions are good or bad according to whether they correspond with your ethical duties or not. And that leaves it open that there are a bunch of intentions that are neither moral nor immoral. They're just sort of unrelated to your duties. So the first one we'll look at is the divine command theory, which is probably like the most common ethical theory throughout history, where the picture is basically what is good is whatever God or the gods sort of put us on this earth to do, right? So your duties are essentially determined by some divine command, right? And we have a picture here of Moses coming down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments, which are specific duties, right? Delivered from on high, like do not kill, do not lie, do not worship graven images, that kind of thing, right? So it's really nice if you believe this, because you have an extremely integrated picture of the universe, right? What's the structure of the universe? Well, we're all God's children. What should I do in the universe? Well, you should do what God said you should do. Like, it's really nice. Like, I wish I had a worldview that was that well integrated with itself, where your sort of picture of the large-scale structure of the universe, your picture of what a good life looks like, really fit together nicely. I don't personally subscribe to any particular religion, so this isn't really much good for me. And philosophy over the last, well, at least Western philosophy over the last couple hundred years has been not really into this either. So philosophers have been trying to separate the religious from the moral. And kind of the main guy of this movement was Immanuel Kant, who was, by the way, extremely religious. He was an extremely devout Christian, but nonetheless thought that it was incredibly important to separate morality from religion, right? So this is one of the movements of the Enlightenment, where we say, no, instead of God said so, we need a different rational basis for morality. His reasons were complex, but had a lot to do with the fact that people have different religions, right, with different divine commands associated with them. So if you're looking to arbitrate ethical disputes, just saying, well, my God said so, doesn't really cut it, does it? It'd be better for that purpose if you had an ethical theory that was derived purely from rational principles, right, that are accessible to everybody, that everybody can rely on. So that was Kant's project. What he wanted to do was essentially get religion out of ethics, kind of to save both religion and ethics. And what he thought, and I'm not going to, his argument for this is long and complicated, and I probably couldn't reproduce it if I tried. I'll just tell you what he ended up with. So Kant wants to make this distinction between two kinds of imperatives. I said at the beginning of this that an imperative is always a kind of normative claim. Well, here's two kinds of normative claims that have very different status, right? So everybody should agree that there are hypothetical imperatives, right? So if you don't want food poisoning, don't eat expired meat, right? So you don't have to believe that there's any kind of like divine overarching moral order to believe that sentence, right? So if this is your goal, then this is what you should do. And it's a hypothetical imperative, right? It's got the form of a conditional. You know, if you want this, then do that. So, you know, if you want to hurt people's feelings, tell them that they're dumb. I think that's true, right? So if that was your goal, that's a good way of going about bringing it about. Believing that the hypothetical imperative is true is not the same as saying that you think it's a good idea or that it would be moral to do that, right? All it says is that there's a relationship between doing this and this outcome. So Kant thinks that hypothetical imperatives, like the things like if you want to succeed in life, you got to work hard, you know, if you want to be rich, you need to get a good job, those aren't really moral principles. So he wants to distinguish these normative principles that are just about getting to a specific goal, hypothetical imperatives, from properly moral imperatives, which he calls categorical imperatives. And he thinks, so he's got 4 different versions of, he thinks there's just one categorical imperative that he derives from pure reason. I won't bother you with the argument for how he got there. He also thinks that there's 4 different versions of this categorical imperative that turn out to be identical. Here's 2 of them anyway. So the one version is always treat people, including yourself, as an end in themselves rather than just as a means. So never use people as mere objects. Always, when you're interacting with somebody, keep in mind that they are also a subject, an autonomous, free agent with deserving of respect and dignity, something like that. And he thinks that he can get that from pure reason alone. It's a book-length argument for that, but and weirdly, he thinks this is exactly equivalent to the following other categorical imperative, which says, act in such a way that you're not making an exception of yourself. His formulation is harder than that, but that's my easy non-philosopher gloss on it, which is saying, like, you know, if you think it's okay to lie, you have to ask yourself, what would happen if everybody lied all the time, right? He thinks that the asking and giving of reasons would break down entirely in that circumstance, and so your action isn't kind of self-undermining in that sense. Do you have a, yeah?
But what if we put it like that? It's okay to lie to a murderer. It would be okay for everyone to lie to a murderer.
To avoid what?
It would be okay to lie to a murderer.
Sorry, I still can't hear the last part. Got to speak up a little.
It's okay to lie to a murderer.
To a murderer, right. Yes, okay, yes. Yes, so there's some question about how you generalize from your actions, and I think that's one of the kind of weaker points in his account. So the question is like, Kant puts it in terms of maxims of behavior. So he says, don't behave in such a way that the rule, the maxim under which you're behaving, couldn't be universalized. And then there's a really tricky question about how you universalize your behavior, how do you derive a rule from the action. So if his example is there's a murderer at the door. Your friend is hiding in your bedroom, and there's an axe murderer knocking at your door and say, hey, is Jim here? And Kant says you should not lie. You should say, yeah, Jim back. So that seems kind of harsh, but it follows from he thinks that follows from pure reason because the maxim of your behavior is it's okay to lie, and if everybody was lying, then we couldn't even talk to each other, like speaking would no longer make sense. But then there's this, like, why is that the maxim? Why not don't lie to axe murderers who are trying to kill your friend? Like, that seems like a very sensible maxim. Everybody could do that. Like, it's never come up for me, so I've always satisfied that maxim. So how do you pick which maxim of your behavior is actually being enacted? And I don't know. I don't know if there's a really good answer to that. So, yeah, so there's Kant. If you're interested in any of this or the arguments for these positions or any of that, take a course on ethics, which is like, this class is just like an ultra compressed course on ethics. So, all right, so those are hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Categorical imperatives for Kant are supposed to be the properly moral ones, where if you violate a categorical imperative, you've done something that's just wrong, rather than something that just frustrates one of your goals. He's also got this nice law, Kant's law, which is a nice sort of like corollary to Hume's law, which says something like this. ought implies can. So it's never the case that you should do something that's impossible for you to do. Another way of putting this is like this. The sphere of things that you ought to do is entirely contained within the sphere of things that it's possible for you to do. Right? So if I say you should stop breathing right now, well, you can't, biologically. Your body will breathe for you whether you want it to or not, so it's impossible for you to be ethically obliged to do that. And this fits really nicely with the overall idea of the ethics of duty, which focuses on intentions. So, the things that you can form an intention to do are the only things that you can be held responsible for. So you're only responsible for your intentions to act, and you cannot form an intention to do something that's impossible for you, right? Which is why you get this. Okay, just by way of explaining Kant's thing. All right, so those are the ethics of duty. We've got the divine command theory. We've got Kant's, he calls it deontological ethics, typically called deontological ethics. We'll just call it Kant's theory. And now we're moving on to the third category of ethical theories, ethics of virtue. So ethics of consequence said you figure out what's good or bad in terms of the consequences of your actions. Ethics of duty said you figure out what's good or bad in terms of the intentions that you form to act and whether they conform to your duties or not. Ethics of virtue says you figure out what's good or bad in terms of what kind of person you should be. Right? And there's a great deal of debate about what kind of person you should be. But basically, they focus their ethics around your character, your dispositions. Kant actually thinks it's more virtuous for a bad person to try really hard to be good than for a good person when it's easy to be good. You're just like, I'm just good all the time because I'm that kind of guy. So he thinks it's more virtuous for somebody to overcome their inclinations, whereas virtue ethics people think, no, that's ridiculous. You need to make yourself the kind of person who acts virtuously in an easy and effortless manner. That's what it is to live a good life, to become the kind of person who does what's right, or who acts in a virtuous manner. Now, a couple of versions of this. Buddhist ethics, this is the Buddha. Buddhist philosophy includes an ethical theory. I think Buddhist philosophy is this vast, sprawling thing. It includes an ethical theory which says something like this. The good life, the life that you should want to live, is a life of renunciation and detachment. Right? So all suffering, according to the Buddha, comes from attachment to things, to temporary things which will inevitably be taken away from you. And the virtuous person is the person with the least level of attachment. So the Buddha walked away from his family, his wife and kids, just left them, went off into the woods and meditated. Like that's the Buddhist model of like what a really good life is, right? Because you minimize your suffering by minimizing the attachments you have to the world. This is very different than the McMindfulness that gets sold to executives, where Buddhism is about being a more effective synergizer or something like that. It's really unappealing when this is early Theravada Buddhism who talk like this. The later Chinese Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, is more about like compassion and helping others. Early Theravada Buddhism is really like, you need to leave everything and everyone you love and sit under a tree until you don't care about anything anymore. So that's their picture of what it is to be a good person, and it comes out, the argument, just in very brief, is from an analysis of suffering. They say, look, I figured out what suffering is. It's attachment. That's the root of suffering. And therefore, to be a good person is to minimize your suffering. All right? So again, morality focused on your character, and moral development in this context is changing your character to better match what a perfect ideal person would look like. Okay. Now contrast that with another ethics of virtue, Aristotelian ethics. So Aristotle argued for what he calls the doctrine of the mean. So what he says are, for any character trait, there's an excess and a deficiency. And your job is to find the middle ground, right? So don't be a coward, but don't be stupidly reckless. Be courageous, which is the middle point between the two, right? So if you're fighting in a war, the kind of thing that Aristotle's friends did a lot, don't run screaming ahead of the pack and sort of like, be reckless on the battlefield, but also don't run away. Yeah. So similarly, don't lie. Don't just run around lying to people, but you don't have to tell everybody everything that you think either, right? If you don't like somebody's clothes, maybe don't share that. Don't overshare, right? You don't have to tell your mom everything that you do either, right? Like sometimes knowing a little less makes somebody happier. So you hit the mean. You tell the truth in the appropriate situations. Similarly, don't spend every night drunk and partying with your friends, but also don't become a recluse and sit under a mango tree until you're enlightened. Aristotle recommends the appropriate amount of parties. You should throw the appropriate number of parties with the appropriate amount of food and the appropriate amount of booze. That's his mean, right? That's the middle ground between over-partying and under-partying. And exactly how that mean is found, he says, is always context dependent. So as a broke student, the appropriate number of parties to throw might not be that many, right? If you were a rich and opulent person later in your life, you should throw a goodly number of dinner parties, share the wealth, share the joy, all that stuff. So compare Aristotle and Buddha here on their pictures of what a good person looks like. For Buddha, the appropriate number of parties to throw is 0. The appropriate amount of booze to drink is 0. Those are both attachments, and you should be becoming as unattached as possible. Whereas Aristotle thinks, actually, he's much more social and interactive, right? Yeah?
But did those Buddhists think about how they were becoming attached to being in the state of detachment?
Yes. So the question is, did those Buddhists think about becoming attached to non-attachment? Yes, they did. Quite a lot. It's the metaphor of the raft addresses that specifically. So the Buddha says, the Dharma is a raft. You use it to cross the river, but once you're across, you throw it away. They had a lot to say about that matter. It did not escape their attention that this is a thing that you could be attached to. Yeah? Okay. I mean, you might not be satisfied with their answer, that's fine, but they definitely did talk and think about it quite a lot. Okay. One more kind. So those are the first 3 kinds. We got one more kind to go through, and then we'll move on to meta-ethics, and we'll be done. So, the ethics of care. These are, we'll do 2 of these, and they both have quite different characters than any of the other ethical theories that we've talked about so far, where instead of asking what I should do, or what intentions I should form, or what kind of person I should be, they ask, how should I act in my social relationships? Right? So what they make the primary object of ethical analysis is your interactions with other people. That makes sense to me. Like, that's the place where if you're alone on a desert island, it's not clear to me that you can live an ethical or like a moral life particularly. Like, you're trying to stay alive, but all of the really interesting stuff about morality is in your interactions with other people, right? So, the most famous one is undoubtedly Confucianism, and Confucianism is like the main philosophy that's dominated Chinese thinking for quite some time, to put it mildly. So Confucius talks about the main relationships in your life. So his picture of the good life goes like this. You got these relationships, ruler to the ruled, father to son, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. Those are the, sorry ladies, you only get to be wife in this. That's your only part in this story. But so those are your primary relationships, and living a good life is precisely to have those relationships be in their proper sort of like form, right? So, and they're all reciprocal relationships. So the ruler has an obligation. So the ruled person, the person who's like, I'm a citizen of this country, there are rulers of this country, so I have an obligation, according to Confucius, to be a good citizen and to follow the rules. but the ruler likewise has a mutual obligation to me to be a good ruler, to run a good state, to make sure that my life is okay, and that kind of thing, right? So these 5 reciprocal relationships of responsibility. And basically Confucius says, like, if you get these relationships going properly, and he has very specific ideas about what's proper to each of these relationships, they're different. Each relationship has its own characteristic and dynamic that should be brought about. But if you get these right, then you have a happy state, you have a happy family, you have happy people, right? And that's what it is to live a good life, is to get these relationships right. Now, notice how different this is from, say, utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics and a lot of the ethics from this kind of Western canon put an enormous emphasis on indifference, right? So if there's 2 people drowning in a river over here and my father drowning in a river right here, I should jump in. According to utilitarians, I should jump in and save those 2 people and let my father drown. Whereas Confucius would say that that's bonkers. He would say you have a much bigger ethical responsibility to your family than to random strangers. And I think most people act that way. I sure act that way in my life. Like, if one of my family's in trouble, I'm going to spend a lot more of my time and energy to try to help them than some random person that I've never heard of, right? So maybe that's just a moral failing. If the utilitarians are right, that's just a moral failing on my part. But if Confucius is right, then that's me acting properly, right? When you prefer people who are in your close social network. Because your primary social relationships are your primary ethical relationships, right? So your duties are defined in terms of these primary social relationships. So you prefer your family. That's the ethical thing to do. Work on the behalf of your family and your community first. Don't be indifferent. So this contrasts, for example, with Moism, which I think I briefly mentioned this. This is a kind of marginal philosophy in China, which said we should be ethical universalists. We should treat everybody as though they're your family, right? Make no preferences, make no distinctions between people who are distant from you or close to you. You should just be like a pure, absolute, loving person to everybody equally. Which is kind of like utilitarianism, kind of like Kantian deontology. Confucius disagrees quite strenuously, right? Okay, so there's Confucianism. There's a version of this from 21st century feminist philosophy called the Ethics of Care, which basically says, well, okay, let me not say that they're the same. Certainly they don't endorse the Confucian ideal that the father is the head of the family and that everybody should do what he says. That is definitely not carried over in the feminist ethic of care. So they conceive of their relationships very differently, but there's a couple of really important shared factors. For example, the rejection of abstract formal theorizing in morality. So what they say similarly is your primary ethical responsibilities are determined by your primary social relationships. The people who are close to you are the people that you have a duty of care for, right? So anytime you enter into a relationship where you're responsible for somebody, where you're taking care of somebody, that's your ethical relationship with them. And it's supposed to be, the way you behave in those relationships according to the feminist ethic of care is not determined by abstract ethical theorizing. It's in fact supposed to be determined by the specific concrete situation that you find yourself in, the specific social and emotional situation that you find yourself in, right? So, like, suppose your friend is cheating on the test. You know that your friend is going to cheat on the test. Kant would say, you got to rat them out because it's wrong to cheat on tests. Now imagine that your friend is having a terrible, terrible time in their life. They're generally a good person, they want to do well in school, they're trying their best, but for some reason just everything has gone wrong for them for the last 2 months, And if they don't pass this test, they're going to get kicked out of school. So that adds a whole bunch of like emotional and social context to this stuff, right? And most Western philosophers of ethics throughout most of history would say, if you take that context into account, you're weak. You're ethically weak. You need to stick to the principles. Whereas the feminist ethic of care says, that's not weak. That's being an ethical person. Taking all those particularities into account is part of what it means to be an ethical person. Right? So you respond to the specific concrete situation that you're in, not to the abstract category that the situation falls under. Right? Okay. So, but again, like, this is not exactly Confucianism because they definitely don't think that like the nuclear family is the proper organization of society, or that everybody should do what dad says, or that you should do what the ruler says all the time. They conceive of these relationships much more broadly and sort of like flexibly than Confucius does. But nonetheless, they both conceive of your primary ethical responsibilities as inhering in your primary social relationships. Okay. So those are all the ethical theories we're going to do. It's not clear to me which one of those is right, or in fact that any one of them is enough all by itself. Right? I think most people, most of the time, will flexibly move between ethical theories as is necessary for their life. Like sometimes you have to say, no, look, it's just wrong to do this. You can't do that. And just this category of thing is just so wrong. I don't care how much you hurt at this time. You have to just suck it up and do what's right. And sometimes the opposite is true, where you have to say, look, this is a case where we just can't follow the rules in this case, right? Yeah. Well, so the question is, isn't Gilligan's feminist ethic of here just an improvement of Confucius? They were developed independently of each other. So they did not draw on Confucius to develop their ethical theory. So to say it's an improvement kind of suggests that they started from Confucius and just added some bells and whistles or threw out some parts they didn't like. It was only later pointed out that these two theories might have something in common. Right? Typical 20th century philosophy, they were only looking at the Western canon when they were comparing this to other things. And it's really only in the 21st century that analytic philosophers have started to look at non-Western original sources. So there's things to be said about the relationship and differences between them, but let's not get too into it right now. If you'd like, I can post there's a nice article comparing Confucian and feminist ethic of care. So I can post that to the Blackboard if you're curious. Right. So this tension between like abstract rules and there's a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about the previous ethics, like the one, for example, let's say my intention, right, is bad.
Oh, sorry,
Previous ones.
these guys.
And, right, so basically the action I do is also bad, according to me.
Okay.
However, the audience looking or watching considers it good, and it has done some good people. What would go on? Like, because the intention was bad, my action according to me was bad. However, you looking at me, for example, would be it's a good action.
So in that case, we just disagree on ethical theory, right? So if you're considering your action to have both bad intentions and bad outcomes, but I think it had either good intentions or good outcomes, we must have a different theory about ethics, right? So it's not a difference. I must be subscribing to a different ethical theory than you are, right? Does that make sense? Like, I don't know how else to parse that situation. Yeah. Okay. All right, where are we here? So yeah, a lot of good fiction comes out of the tension between abstract moral rules and concrete moral particulars. Like, this is basically most Star Trek episodes where, oh no, we can't violate the Prime Directive, but oh, we really have to this time. Ooh, which one's right? And I think that the tension and the fun of the story, if you think Star Trek is fun at all, comes from the fact that you find both perspectives somewhat plausible, right? They can bring you, like a good story brings you into a place where you're like, oh, I really agree with this side, and I really agree with that side. What should we do? So I take it that most people, most of the time, actually probably accept like a variety of these and emphasize them differently depending on what's going on. Philosophers love to try to drive a wedge between them, though. Say, look, you've got to pick one. So here's a case where you might have to pick one. Outcomes versus consequences, at least. So here's the scenario. A person is admitted to a hospital in a coma. At the same time, in the same hospital, there happen to be 5 other people who will die without organ transplants. And none are available. There's no organ transplants available. The doctor is certain that they can make the family of the person in the coma believe that they died of natural causes. And while they're stable, it's uncertain whether they can be revived. So the question is, should the doctor kill this person, harvest their organs, and save 5 other people? So it seems to me that the consequences of that action are actually good. So one of these families, at least one family is going to be devastated by the loss of their loved one, but it's the choice between 1 or 5. Yeah? So the suggestion is the doctor could put the responsibility on the family. Well, the family's going to say no. Let's suppose the family, if you ask the family, they would be like, no, you can't kill my husband. I need them, right? I think that's what if some doctor said to me, hey, can I kill your family member? Because it would be really convenient for our workflow. I think I would definitely say no. Yes, that would be impolitic to word it that way. So I would suggest that the outcome here is better, but there's something wrong with, like, do you agree that we should be a little bit worried about, like, does anybody like, yeah, kill him, go for it? Yeah, you're like, yeah, kill him. Okay, so you're probably inclined toward the utilitarian side of things, where you're like, look, we just have to figure out what the best outcome is. And so the doctor's kind of violating their duties. Yeah, they spoke an oath saying they wouldn't kill people. You know, you expect when you send somebody to the hospital, they're not going to be like gratuitously killed. So there's definitely like their professional role, their responsibilities, they have duties that they would violate, but for the sake of a better outcome. And this is the kind of thing philosophers love to do. They love to put you in these horrible moral situations and say, now what? Now what are you going to do? Okay, so you guys weren't really into this like killing the person thing. Like, one person stuck up their hand and be like, yeah, I'm confident that you should definitely kill them. Okay, what about this one? The trolley problem. The trolley's rolling down a track towards 5 people. You're standing by a switch, and you could switch it to have it only hit 1 person. You can't stop the trolley. There's nothing you can do but flip the switch. If you do nothing, 5 people die. If you do something, 1 person dies. Now, do you flip the switch? No, you have no other options. Don't try to worm out of this. Make the choice. Come on. Sorry? Who is the 1 person? Assume you don't know any of them. Assume you don't know any of these people. Okay, hands up. Who would flip the switch? All right. So the 1 person who put up his hand for the last one is the only one of you who's consistent in this, right? These 2 are structurally the exact same, right? You're choosing between 1 life and 5 lives, unless there's a difference. Is there a salient difference here? Yeah.
Well, in the previous question,
yeah.
It was a chance the person could pull through. And so you're actively making the decision. It's like, okay, well, you know, there's a situation where this person...
Guys, can you not talk while we're...
And then these 5 people...
Okay. Okay.
But in this situation, it's this person either died or these 5 people have to die. There's no way around it.
Okay, good. So the response was, in the last one, the coma guy might have survived if you just left him alone. Right. Or girl. Okay. Philosophers love this kind of thing. Philosophers love to put you in like incredibly improbable and unlikely, soul-rending thought experiments and then probe your intuitions about what's true. Do you see how this is a question about consequences versus intentions? Like, don't form the intention to kill people is a pretty good rule in general, right? Like in most of our lives, most of the time, that's a darn good rule about what your duties are, what your duty to form intentions look like. And this is meant to put you in a situation where you have to choose between that and a clearly better outcome. Clearly better outcome, right? Yeah.
Like, I would choose to switch it.
Yeah.
Because in this case, people are going to die anyway. Like,
Right.
if you were, like, let's say, like, in a tsunami or something, in a natural disaster,
Yeah.
and, like, you're there to help people, I feel like your natural response would be to help, like, the most people that you could.
Right.
Or, like, a child or something.
Yeah.
But just because, like, you allowed other people to die, you didn't kill them.
Right, right. So there's a difference between allowing people to die and killing them. I think, well, I mean, that sounds, so it's not different in terms of outcome, but it might be different in terms of your intention or the kind of character that comes from or the way that it affects your relationships, right? So like letting somebody die has no difference in the quality of the outcome versus causing somebody to die, but it might differ in all these other ways. So the difference, if you feel that there's a difference here, probably is a difference located in one of the other kinds of ethical theory other than utilitarianism. Yeah? There's another version of the trolley problem where it's, instead of flipping a switch, you're on a bridge. So there's a trolley running towards 5 people, there's just one track, and you're standing on a bridge between a really big guy, and your choice is, do I push the big guy or not? And that's structurally the exact same as this thing, right? But far fewer people are like, yeah, push him. Weird, right? In terms of utility, in terms of like how many people you have to kill to make what happen, pushing that guy is exactly the same as flipping the switch. But most people find it like much more distasteful than flipping the switch. There's a lot of psychology research done on this actually, and they've started putting people in virtual reality versions of this to see if like being embodied in the space makes any difference to whether you'd actually push the guy or not. It's, anyway. Yeah. Sorry? Right, you're more hands-on. Yeah, flipping the switch has got a sort of physical remove, whereas it would have to be you'd have to like feel the guy's sweaty back and like. But does that make an ethical difference? Not really. It's hard to see why. Yeah. It's not specified. The question is, does this big guy know the situation that he's in? It's not specified by the thought experiment, so they don't actually say. You could add those details if you wanted, but yeah, usually they don't have that much detail in it. Yeah.
I think, honestly, it's the same situation because I don't think the guy has any right to decide who gets to die or live or not.
Yeah, yeah. So the comment is, it's the same because this person has no right to decide who lives or dies. It's very duty-based, right? So you have a duty not to like take people's other, you have a duty to respect all people's sort of like lives. You have a duty to like not take people's lives, not take actions that end lives. So those are all, Kant would love that. Kant would say, yeah, you got it. You got the idea. There's a rule here, right? There's a rule that says don't act in such a way that people are caused to die. And that rule overrides the fact that it would be nice if you could only have one person die rather than 5 people die. Okay? So, okay, that's probably enough of that. These are just like a taste of the kind of things philosophers like to do to try to drive a wedge between people whose intuitions go one way and intuitions go the other way and get them to fight with each other. It's fun. And if you like this stuff, take a class on ethics because they do a lot of this stuff. All right. So we're almost done here. We did behavior. You all behave. We did goals. You all have goals. We did values. I would suggest that in the sense of values just being big meta goals, being goals about what goals to set, you all have values. Now, it's not necessary that you all have some ethical theory that you subscribe to. Most people, most of the time, get by just fine without having a theory about what values to have, right? My father talks about olfactory morality. That is, I know when something's wrong, I can smell it, right? And that's perfectly fine for almost everybody almost all the time. Given that this is a philosophy class, we're going to talk about the ethical theories. So those are like theories about what values you should have, what's important. And then there's a further question, isn't there, about like, how do you justify an ethical theory? Can you justify an ethical theory? Does all this values talk even make sense in the first place? And are ethical claims a matter of opinion? Are they culturally relative or something like that? And how do you justify a moral theory? And they ask questions like, uncomfortable questions like, are ethical claims factual claims? Factual claims usually refer to objects in space and time. You check their truth by looking for the object in that place and at that time. Now, if I say murder is wrong, where do you look for that fact? Where is it located in space? Did murder start becoming wrong at some point? Will it stop being wrong at some further point? The questions are really weird, right? Like, they're structurally similar to questions like, does the number 5 really exist? And if so, where? Uncomfortable questions. So one response to that kind of quite uncomfortable question is ethical anti-realism, which was popular in at least English-speaking philosophy for much of the 20th century. The logical positivists, they were called, thought ethical talk was literally nonsense. When you say murder is wrong, you've said nothing of actual semantic significance. And they argued for this by using what they call their picture theory of language. So very, very briefly, the picture theory of language says this. Language can do one and only one thing. Name objects, so here is a bottle, and then describe the relationship between objects. The bottle is on the table, right? And the name for the object, the name for this object, get arranged in a sentence that tells you how the objects are arranged relative to each other. And that's it, they said. That's the only thing that language can properly be said to do, right? This is not a popular picture of how language works anymore. It turned out to be like pretty oversimplified, right? There's lots of other things that language does, like, you know, ask questions, or like you say hello to somebody. Like what objects is that picture exactly? So they have a lot of work to translate all of our normal speech into this picture theory of language, but if you believe that that's all that language can do, what happens to morality? Well, where are the moral facts? What objects do they inhere in? None. That's it. If you believe the picture theory of language describes all that language can do, you should therefore conclude that, so this was part of their broad project in philosophy. Like, people confronted with philosophy often go like, guys, can you just get rid of all this nonsense? You're talking a bunch of nonsense. Just get down to the facts, please. Just do that. So everybody who feels that way about philosophy, go check out the logical positivists and see how that went for them. Not that great, but they tried at least. They really, really tried to like cut out all the nonsense, all the metaphysics, get rid of all that. I think is being the ground of nothingness, or is nothingness the ground of being? Stop all that. Tell me things about objects in the world, or shut up, say the logical positivists. And since moral facts are not objects in the world, therefore, shut up about morality, was the conclusion, right? Now again, this is predicated on the believing the picture theory of language, which is quite unpopular these days, seemingly indefensible, but I think there are probably a few people around who still believe this. Now that contrasts, that was a kind of one brand of ethical, I'm not going to go through like a million different versions of these. There's a bunch of different versions of ethical anti-realism. Ethical realism is just like all of the things that we were just talking about, right? All of those ethical theories are varieties of ethical realism who think that there are at least some moral facts. And with utilitarianism is the clearest example as far as I'm concerned, where like there's just a fact of the matter. If you accept the utilitarian account of morality, there's just a fact of the matter about what's right and what's wrong. We can measure it, we can test it, we can like see what will produce the most happiness for the most people. So it's kind of moral realism. That is, there are moral facts. Right. So that was just really brief. If you want more, if you want more meta-ethics, if you want more ethical theories, an ethics class will be enough. But that was just like your whirlwind tour through normativity. And I want to just quickly bring this back to what I want from you in the argument analyses. So specifically, do not talk about ethical theories in your argument analyses. all right? I'm not going to give you I'm probably going to pick a newspaper editorial of 500 words long. They're not going to be debating whether deontological ethics or virtue ethics are the right one. So you don't have to deal with the ethical theory. So forget about the ethics level. The ethics level is what justifies the normative claims, the values claims. Do take into account the values claims, right? Do talk about the value claims that are being used. If they're being implicitly used, like they assume that you agree with their values, or sometimes people put it explicitly. They say, this is important. So include those as premises, obviously. So forget about ethics, basically, from this moment forward. Don't worry about ethics in this course. Do worry about values, okay? And just as a kind of exercise, I put a survey on Blackboard that I'd like you to complete before midnight on October 3rd. It's called the Rokeach Values Survey. And basically all you're going to have to do is order your personal values. There's two categories. There's terminal values, which are things that you want to bring about. And there are instrumental values, which are your opinions about how you should behave as you're bringing about your goals. This is just like a tiny nod to what education sells itself as being, as like thinking about what's important to you in your life. So it's good for your soul. It will show you a list of 32 different values. So that's a nice sort of like reiteration of what values are and what the values level is. So do that. We'll talk about it. But mostly, test next time. So be ready for that. All right.